All right, everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is James Makes Clothes, and today we are applying our waistband pattern to our original vintage jeans pattern. So we've done our muslin, which is our prototype of our pattern here. And my muslin actually fits really nice, so I don't have to alter it. But what I'll do is I'll just explain a little bit what you would want to do if you had any fit issues with your muslin. Take the time to subscribe to my channel and alert yourself when I come out with all the new videos, because I add on to the previous videos that I've done in the past. So today if you haven't watched the video on creating the jeans pattern from vintage jeans or copying a vintage jeans pattern, I suggest you watch that. Take some time because it is a long step-by-step process. Then the next video is creating the prototype. And now that I have the prototype, we're going to be creating our waistband. So the waistband is the last part of your pattern. And I'm just going to talk about some fitting issues. Now, for me, my muslin fit really good. But if your muslin's having fit issues, I'll just talk about the typical fit issues. So hopefully this troubleshoots this for you. Now, you've tried on your muslin and say it's tight across the butt. So what that means is that either your hip curve isn't wide enough or curved enough on your pants pocket, or you don't have enough width in this area here. So what I would suggest doing is, if you took the time to get this part matching close to your jeans on the back pattern, I would just add a little bit to the hip curve, which is just right in this area here. So this would be your hip curve. That should take care of too tight across the butt. If it's too loose, again, you would take it in at the hip curve before you tried anything else. Now, if you have put it on and the part at the back is gaping, it's just a little bit too big. So what I would do is I would take this in here. So what I would do is take it in slightly here. So curve this line a little bit more and then curve this in a little bit more. And that should fix any gaping at the back, the lower back. I know some people, if they have a small waist and larger curve around the butt, it'll tend to gape at the back. So that should take care of that by just taking it in slightly here and here. And what you do is you're marking this on your muslin. So you have the muslin on and then you're pinching or releasing the seam where it's too tight or too big. And you're marking it on your muslin and then you're adjusting it on the pattern. So another fit issue is too low in the rise in the front. Now, I didn't have this problem because I matched my rise, which is this part here. I matched that rise to my pattern quite nicely, so I didn't have any issues. But if you did have issues and the rise was too low, you would just add a little bit to here, right? But not so much that it affects the curve, because you want this part of your pattern, if this is your jeans, you want this at a 90-degree angle and this to curve up. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is if you do the hip curve in the back, make sure you true your pattern in the front too. So if you have a lot to take off, don't just take it off of one pattern piece, take it off of both sides. So split the difference and take it off this side and take it off this side. This is your hip curve. The back pattern doesn't matter. If your jeans aren't long enough, that would sometimes be an issue. Just add more to the hem. That's pretty straightforward. Make sure that when you are fitting that here, you're also keeping in mind the yoke. So remember I mentioned that hip curve area. When you're altering the hip curve, make sure you take the yoke onto your pants pattern like so, and then adjust the curves and all of that together as one piece. So you want to attach the yoke to the pattern and then alter your pattern like that. What I had a correction from the video, you'll notice that my correction was that I had put a curve right in here, and this is the fly front facing where the zipper gets attached to, that protects the your fabric underneath from the zipper. This protects that. So I made this a curve, so I'm actually just gonna make this a square, like typical commercial pants patterns. But other than that, everything was nicely going together on my muslin. So if you have any issues with your muslin and you're not sure how to correct it, make sure you drop a comment below. I'm going to fix this pattern piece and into a square, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make our waistband after. So first you want to make sure you grab some scrap paper. This looks pretty good for a waistband, so I'm going to put this to the side. I want some scrap paper. I always save all my scrap paper so that I always have something on the side. All we're going to do is trace our previous pattern. We can do that, or we can just tape something onto it and create a square. Let's just tape our square on. This is, if you have to add to a pattern, that makes it super easy. Same with if you're adding, if you messed up a seam allowance or something. Just keep your scrap paper aside and just tape the excess on. It really doesn't matter. It saves yourself from, this is a nice shape. I like this, the seam allowance. So just create some lines. Again, we're making a square, and I'm just gonna extend mine half an inch, just so that I can get a longer edge in order to top stitch. I was having some issues in the video where the top stitching wasn't going, but it's because my zipper was also a little too long. But I'm still going to extend that down a little bit because of my notch. I found the notch on my pattern was hitting right here, so I want it to just be slightly longer. And then we're going to, this is our folding notch to indicate that we're going to fold it in half, so we'll indicate that. Okay, updated piece. Okay, so I got this nice piece for my waistband. So what we're going to do is tape all our pieces together, okay? So any part that's going to be in the waistband, we've got to tape our pattern together. Okay, so make sure you put your facing pattern in. All right, we're going to just attach that to where we would sew it. Don't forget the yoke. See, I always forget the yoke, but it's very important. See these lines right here? These are my stitching lines. That's why they're still on there, because when I want to true my pattern, you tape it on the stitching lines. Okay, now we're going to simulate them being joined at the hip. Alright, so you can see our curve, but we're not creating a curved waistband, alright? We don't want to do that. We want to create a straight waistband, and we want to iron it straight as well. And remember, this piece is extended in the front, so we want to make sure this piece is on, because our waistband's going to get stitched starting from here, and then it's going to finish overlapped on the other side. Okay, so once we've taped all our sections together, we're just going to take this measurement, multiply it by 2, and then make sure that, well, we're already going to have that overlap here, so we'll just take the measurement from here to here. So we'll take our measurement from here to here to this stitch line, and then we'll add our seam allowance on our waistband to the edge here. We'll measure it out, and then we will take that measurement, apply it to our waistband. So it's half the waistband, so we're going to start in the center back on our fold, and then we're going to walk half our pattern along, and hopefully it works. So we'll call this the center back. So the tool I use is a bodkin. That's what that is. You don't need a bodkin, but you just need something that's kind of stabs. So keep your pencil nearby. And then what we're going to do is walk along our seam allowance line from the center back where I folded it. I'm going to indicate that with a notch. You don't need a fancy notcher like mine, but it does help create, nice notches like that. Just walk your pattern along the curves like so. And this is the sewing line, right? And once once I get to where the side is, I'm going to indicate that with a notch. Of course, we're just going to draw our pencil, so that's our side. Now make sure you pivot your pattern, because this is very crucial when you're checking your pattern to make sure you follow along the curve. Okay, so I've got an inaccurate measurement, so I'm going to start again. It's going to go, make sure I follow the curve, because it's just saying my measuring was slightly off, and I don't want to go and start cutting up my pattern in case I'm sure. Okay, and you can see it's over by about 1/4 of an inch, so we're just going to indicate it there. Make sure I've squared it. I was just off by 1/8 of an inch, not bad. That seam allowance, we don't cut it off to where the seam allowance is, just take 1/8 of an inch off of the end of your pattern. So I'm going to indicate the width of my facing here, and then we're going to draw our buttonholes. So this part of your jean is important because this is where the buttons and the buttonholes go. Now we've indicated our center back seam with a notch, our side seam with a notch, and what I like to do is I like to indicate the overlap or the kind of facing part, because this is where we're going to have to mark our buttonholes down in this area. So I don't put this down until my waistband has been trued. Okay, so we're going to notch that part, and then this is going to be our buttonholes. For putting our button right in the center, you want your buttonhole to stop 1/8 of an inch past, so your buttonhole is off to the side, right? You kind of need to know where or what size your button is before you start drawing the buttonhole. So a lot of the times I would just save that till the very end. Say like your waistband works great, you've sewn it on, your pattern works, but a good thing to do is look at your jeans that you have and measure what they've done. That's probably the simplest thing, because you're copying basically your jeans, so you just revert to your jean pattern. I'll go get it. Okay, so these are the jeans. This is our marking, okay? So my waistband's a little wider than theirs, all right? And my facing point is a little bit bigger than theirs, you can see. Mine, it's very, very close. With seam allowance and everything, it's very, very close. So we have to make sure, we have to remember that the edges all have seam allowance, and that's why I suggest drawing them on, because you can see that this is the seam allowance here. So this is where we're going to put our button if this was sewn on, and this is why you can just lay out your pieces like so, because then you can just lay it on, imagine where it's going to be sewn, and mark your button accordingly. So our button is going to be here. Okay? Now we want to make, so when I trace that out, I'm going to mark that with a pattern marker. That's going to be where my button is. We're going to worry about the size of our buttonhole when we find out what button we're using, but just indicate the buttonhole here, just so you know what side to sew everything on. And it's just 1/8 of an inch past each one, so it totals 1/4 of an inch thick roughly. But again, this is our buttonhole setting. We're just going to indicate this is where our buttonhole is on our pattern. We're just going to fold our waistband in half and copy the notches for the other side. So we're just going to notch everything as is. And then we are ready to cut out our waistband and sew it onto our muslin to make sure that everything works perfect. We're just going to fold our waistband in half and copy the notches for the other side. So we're just going to notch everything as is. And then we are ready to cut out our waistband and sew it onto our muslin to make sure that everything works perfect. Once that's done, you guys, we can get our jean fabric or whatever you want to use. I have some corduroy coming, so I'm going to make my pants, my new jeans out of corduroy, and that's going to be our next video. Now, a lot of the times, to know that it's the back, you have to do a double notch in the back. where the notches are, that's where I place my pins. I don't pin the whole waistband on. I just put pins where the notches are, and then that way I know that I'm on the right track sewing wise. Okay, so this is going to line up with the center back seam, and then this is just going to be slightly off to the side. No big deal, but that indicates the center back there. So now we updated our pattern pieces. I'm just going to cut this out now and we're going to sew it on. Fold my waistband in half, and I'm just cutting it on the fold like this. If you don't have rotary cutters, I suggest you get one. They are such a lifesaver. Here we go. There's our waistband. We're going to press it and stitch it on. So we're going to fold our waistband in half, and then we're going to actually press one side's seam allowance under, because this is the part that we have to edge stitch under when we fasten the waistband on. So you'll see when I actually sew it together. So we're going to fold it in half and then fold this side. Because this muslin doesn't really have a right side, I can get away with it, but you'd have to do a little bit more planning with what side gets folded under. It's the side that's facing outwards. It gets folded under and then edge stitched, because this is going to be our outside of our waistband, and then we're going to just fold our 3/8 inch seam allowance under, which is 1 centimeter. Press the seam allowance of the ends in as well. All right, everyone, so I pinned the notches together, and I pinned the back side of the waistband, the part that's going to be on the back, facing the back. I pinned it to the wrong side of the fabric, and no need to pin the whole entire waistband on. Just the notches is sufficient, and make sure that when you're sewing, you don't sew into the seam allowance on either the waistband. So you leave the edge of the waistband's seam allowance open. You don't sew to that. So you start 1 centimeter in, and then make sure you use your seam guide to sew the waistband on, so that you know you're exactly doing that 1 centimeter 3/8 inch that you indicated. Lining up your seam allowance perfectly is important, because when the jeans close, you want the waistband to line up nicely when you're looking at it. So first, just sew the waistband on. Don't pull the jeans, the pants, in order to sew the waistband on. Ease the waistband into ease the jeans. Yeah, ease the waistband onto the curve of the jean. And you'll know you're on the right track because you've indicated where the notches are with your pinning. And if you sew within the notches and there's no bunching, that means your waistband is going on quite nicely. It's a little tricky sewing the waistband on. That's why we are doing our muslin and practicing our sewing techniques before we use our nice expensive fabric. Fashion design is a lot of planning and sewing and revisiting that pattern. So it can be a little time consuming, but it's enjoyable. So once we get to the other side of the waistband, we're going to stop right at the seam allowance at the end of the waistband. So stop 1 centimeter before the edge. Okay, and then we're going to sew well, I noticed that my waistband is actually a little long, so I just clipped that edge off, and I'm saving it because I'm going to apply that piece of fabric measurement to my finished waistband. So what I'm going to do is, you've already pre-pressed the opposite seam allowance under, and we're going to pin the notches to the notches on the waistband like we did before. That way we won't get any twisting or bunching with our finished waistband. You don't want the fabric to be twisting or bunching. So to keep that from happening, again, you line it up at the notches. What we're also going to do is you do line it up at the notches, but then we are pinning it at the previous seam stitch line that we just did. So we're lining up the two stitch lines. Ideally, you would sew them right on top of each other. So you want to turn your waistband over exactly in half. And if you folded your seam allowance under correctly, it should line up very, very nicely. Before we pin the edges on, we have to make sure that we sew the edges of the waistband together. So you flip them right so that the right sides of the fabric are together, and you stitch starting from the 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you continue on to the fold line of the waistband, do a back tack to secure it, and then once we finish the other side, we're going to clip the seam allowance edge, just so it doesn't create any bunching when we fold our waistband. So that's a little trick that you can do when you're sewing, is when you're sewing an edge together and you have to fold it inside out, you clip the seam allowance to reduce the bulk. I'll use a pair of scissors in order to push out the corner and get it a little sharper. If you notice it's not going too sharp, make sure you check to see maybe to clip enough of the seam fabric out. So we see that it's lining up quite nicely with the band, and all we need to do is tuck the seam allowance under, and we're going to top stitch our waistband down on the right side of the fabric. Well, first we have to fold our jeans right side out again, and we're going to stitch. So when I'm stitching the waistband on, you want to make sure that you hold the waistband as flat as possible. If you need to pin the top of the waistband together to keep the fold, to make sure it's folded in half, you can do that. You have creased the fabric up there, so you should always be able to see your fold line regardless. And as I sew, I am pulling the body of the jeans and the waistband apart to create as much tension at the seam as possible so that the fabric is pulled tight. And then when I edge stitch, the idea that what you want to happen is you want your top stitching to go right through to the other side and line up as perfectly as possible. If you pull the fabric apart and line up your waistband like I'm doing, you should get it very close. And edge stitching is usually about 1 to 2 millimeters from the edge of the fold line. So 1 to 2 millimeters from the edge of the underturned seam. And then I'm top stitching that on. And I'm pulling the body of the pants and the waistband apart while also keeping the waistband flat in between my fingers. Okay, when you get to the edge of the waistband, make sure you don't sew right to the complete edge. Make sure you stop 1 centimeter before the edge so that you can fold those corners under, and then you can continue on sewing to the edge of the waistband. And if it lines up perfectly, you've done your job. If it's not lining up perfectly, there's been some mismeasurements with your seam allowance or your cutting. So tucking that seam allowance under. Back stitch. that is good for our test. I am going to check the way that my waistband zips up, and you can see I've got the edge pretty nice underneath. It's kind of like you're sewing blind with that underneath part, so it can be a little tricky, but I've got no bends, no corners, and my waistband lines up nicely on the top. So let's zip it up and find out and see how our work is. So when you zip it up, you want your waistband to have no bunching on the top, and you want the two pieces to line up nicely. So I've got success with mine. It lines up nice on the top. There's no bunching underneath. So once we've got our waistband lined up and it looks good, we're going to just revisit any corrections on our waistband pattern, and we are ready to sew and use our new pattern. So thank you so much for watching, everyone, and stay tuned for the next video where I sew the jeans together.